Zen at the Sharp End. Welcome to the podcast about how to turn difficult people and relationships into your best teachers. I'm Mark Westmackett, a Zen Buddhist teacher, mindfulness teacher, and ex-professional astronomer. This is a podcast to go along with my latest book, Zen and the Art of Dealing with Difficult People, which is out now and available to order in all the usual places. In each episode, we'll be exploring different varieties of people, relationships, and situations that we find irritating, difficult, or painful. Together with a number of Zen friends, I'll be discussing how the practices of Buddhism and mindfulness can help us see our difficult people as troublesome Buddhas, our greatest teachers. This podcast is sponsored by Zenminded, an online lifestyle store offering you the very best in Japanese craft, incense, and other Zen-inspired home goods. Check it out at www.zenminded.uk. I think I first came across the phrase troublesome Buddhas some years ago. I remember I went to my Zen teacher, Daizan Skinner, and I had some frustrations with one of the other members of our Zen group. And I remember he encouraged me to try to see this person a little bit like a grain of sand in an oyster. So as we know, what starts off as an irritant for the oyster, this grain of sand, it has the potential to turn into the most beautiful pearl. And like that, I remember him saying, the people we find irritating or frustrating or painful, if we let them, they can offer us pearls of wisdom into how we are, our patterns, our habits, the buttons that get pushed, our attitudes. And they give us an opportunity to respond to those difficulties with greater compassion, understanding, wisdom. I remember it was a hard pill to swallow, and to some extent it still very much is. But this idea of seeing difficult people as troublesome Buddhas has totally changed my practice over the years. And I now feel deeply grateful for that person in our community who I had those initial frustrations with that I went to Daizan. And I now feel deeply grateful for that person in our community that I had those initial frustrations with. So this book came about, I remember talking with Daizan a little bit after New Year, the beginning of 2019, and we were talking about how we could bring, or how it might be possible to bring more of the teaching of Zen and mindfulness into the realm of relationships. And we were thinking about the ideas of a book, or maybe some talks, or a retreat day, something like that. And initially, I remember we talked about romantic relationships. And Daizan, I think, saw me as being, in a sense, more qualified than him because I was married. But I mean, I don't know, how could I possibly be more qualified than my Zen teacher? But at least, perhaps I thought we could write it together. And, well, it turned out in those first few months of 2019, he was busy and, I started to plan out the book and it just started to take on a life of its own. Now, one of the things about Zen is that it's seen as a practice of calming, quiet, peacefulness, equanimity, and we have this cultural phrase, to be Zen. How can I be more Zen? Or gosh, you're very Zen today, that kind of thing. Now, in my understanding of Zen, this place of equanimity and peacefulness, it might be where we get to after some years of quite a lot of years of practice, but or it may not be. But that's kind of not really the point. And often our practice is not something of peacefulness and quiet. In fact, it can often be anything but, really. And so there's a lot of teaching in Zen around realizing your true nature, which really can be all well and good when we're sitting alone in this semi-ideal circumstance of sitting on our cushion by ourselves quietly, not so many distractions. But the question is, how do we live from this place of our true nature? How do we live our true nature at the sharp end of life? When the heat rises, when emotions start to bubble over, and we no longer feel quite as in control, or technically to feel regulated, when we start to feel dysregulated. So keeping in touch with your true nature, I can tell you, when we're in a rage or feeling deeply hurt, is advanced practice. I think there's an analogy here with learning a new language. I think there's an analogy here with learning a new language. When we start, it takes effort just to form a simple sentence. And the equivalent in meditation would be just staying focused, present and aware when we're sitting in this, as I say, semi-ideal conditions of by ourselves quietly on our cushion. And then we try simple interactions and eventually start to make conversations with people in this new language. So the equivalent would be starting to allow or bring the insights of our meditation out into daily life. Like learning how to chop a carrot with mindfulness, learning how to go and do the shopping and not get, caught up into too much drama as we're standing at the supermarket queue. And then as we get more fluent with our language, we may even start to lose some of our foreign accent in normal conversations. I've seen this with people who are very, been talking English for many, many years. They start to sound very English. But I remember noticing back in my astronomy days, I used to come across and meet and work with many people from other countries who would be speaking English as a foreign language. And they might be speaking, with a very mild accent in normal everyday interactions. And then when they got stressed, like for example, they were giving a talk at a conference, or they started to shout and get very emotional, I'd noticed their accent would often get much, much stronger. So it's a little bit trying to stay... So it's a little bit like trying to stay present and aware of what's going on as the heat of stress or emotion rises in our meditation practice, in our applying of Zen to our daily life. How can we stay present, aware and in touch, sensitive as the heat rises, and avoid solidifying our perspective into a sense of I'm right and you're wrong, this hardening? But I think it's totally possible. It takes practice, but it's absolutely possible. Some parts of the book were, I remember, really quite difficult to write. I spent quite a long time looking deeply at my own process, trying to find ways of expressing what seemed to me to be very complicated feelings, realizations, insights, situations. And my wife, who's a speech and language therapist, she's got a good handle on ways of expressing difficult things. Over those months of writing, really helped me to refine, simplify the text, and communicate what I was trying to communicate, hopefully anyway. But one of the loveliest things about writing this book was I invited a whole range of people from our Zen community to contribute examples of difficult situations and people from their own lives, and how they'd come to deal with those situations and people and what they learned from it. And I interviewed a number of these people, and they told me some absolutely inspiring stories and accounts of these range of difficult people that they'd encountered. So, in the book we've got examples from family issues, parents, children, siblings, marriage breakdown, problems at work with work colleagues and neighbours, and all the way down to what seem to be very trivial examples of car parking frustrations, or those kinds of simple everyday kind of situations. But actually, if we look at them as we see in the book, if we look at them with honesty and clarity, those situations, even those trivial ones, can be extremely enlightening, and we can find out a lot about who we are and how to apply the teachings of Zen. So that's really what this podcast is going to be all about. We're going to be exploring, talking to different people. And as I say in the introduction of the book, this book, well, I could say also this podcast, is for anyone wanting to learn how to respond to difficult people and situations with more clarity and wisdom. You might be someone who has a number of troublesome people in various quarters of your life, or perhaps you have one particularly enraging one, or you might have brushed up against an array of them at different points in your life. You can see that there's often a pattern to your behaviour in relation to them, and it usually causes pain, perhaps a great deal of pain. And the only way we can grow is by facing this pain, acknowledging how we feel and how we've reacted, and making a commitment to end this repeating pattern of suffering. So to kick off this podcast, I'm going to be speaking with my Zen teacher, Daizan, who I've been studying with for a little over 10 years now. So welcome, Daizan. Thanks for coming along on the podcast. So maybe we could start with just having a look at this phrase, troublesome Buddhas, which I mention and use quite a lot through the book. That has a bit of a sort of Zen connection and history. So where does that phrase come from?
Okay, so there's a phrase, Buddhas appear troublesomely and ancestors teach in detail, in the work by Zen Master Kaizen called the Denkuroku. Zen Master Kaizen was a Soto Zen master from the 14th century, and this particular translation that contains that phrase appears in a book called Zen is Eternal Life, translated by Zen Master Jiyu Kennet. And I spent, near enough 14 years or so practicing in and around a monastery that was in her lineage. And this phrase was quite often on people's lips. The way that the monastery was organized, which was pretty traditional, was that particularly as a new person, you were basically never alone. You lived in the meditation hall. You had 3 feet by 6 feet of living space, like one tatami mat living space on the meditation platform, with a couple of cupboards, one for your bedding, one for your clothes, and people either side of you. And an image that was often used for this life process was of a rock tumbler, where in come these kind of pebbles, these stones which are just fresh off the beach, rough and unfinished, and they grind in this kind of drum against each other over months and years, and all being well, out come beautiful jewels. And so this interpersonal dimension of Zen practice, very much at the heart of it all, seemed to be something that isn't terribly sort of highlighted really in Western approaches to Zen. And it's one I found incredibly painful and incredibly valuable, really, over the years, I'd say, and continued right through my time in Zen temples and monasteries. And so I'm so grateful that you've gone to the trouble of really going into this and really exploring and laying out what it means to work with difficult people, and the deep, deep value that this actually brings to us in terms of our spiritual growth and development.
And I wonder if that rock tumbler image, has been used throughout Zen, of people coming to practice in a monastery, in Kaizen's time, for example, would that have been something that had been at the forefront?
Well, it's a good question. Of course, back then they wouldn't have had these rock tumblers, I'm guessing. I don't know, they might have had something parallel. But that sense of interpersonal stresses and strains is very clear. Kaizen himself was a kind of a little bit of a perfect little monk, and he had trouble living with people who were less than perfect. And like many sort of perfectionist types, he had real problems with anger, and it got to the point where his sort of spiritual life was on the line, apparently, as a young guy. He nearly attacked somebody and did some serious harm. And I believe it was that sort of knife edge where he actually did manage to avoid doing whatever damage it was. We don't know the full story, but he managed to turn a corner with this anger. And it seems that later on in life, he was a very known to be a very loving and very accepting person. So he clearly himself had some troublesome Buddhas to work with. So this is nothing new. I guess as long as human beings have existed, they've been group animals. We are a group animal. And as we have, even Sartre saying, hell is other people. So we can't live with them, can't live without them, And so this is such a rich and vitally important dimension of any kind of meaningful growth and development.
Yeah, and I think that maybe people have this cultural view of Zen, to be Zen is to be calm and collected and sort of unflappable. But I think maybe that, as I discuss a little bit in the book, that may or may not be the end point or the sort of result of our practice. But to get to that point, we need to be able to deal with and come to terms with and learn from all those human relationships with people.
100%, yeah. Part of it's a skill set. There's an art or a skill of dealing with other people, and particularly difficult people. And then part of it, probably the most important part, is, if you like, a disposition or an alignment or an ability to just let things come and go without, as it were, sort of buying into them or identifying too much with the stuff coming your way. And both are very, very important. And most of us are not living in the artificial world of a sort of Zen monastery, sardines in a tin kind of approach. So, in a sense, I think we have to, as it were, work a little harder on this. It's not on a plate. So we can hide out more readily. We can avoid stuff. And particularly the type of personality that gets into Zen practice in the Western world, I see, is frequently the type of person who is quite good at creating their own little insulated, controlled world where there aren't too many troublesome Buddhas around. And that's a shame, because then it slows things up.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your own history of working with troublesome Buddhas, and if you've got any particular examples that sort of jump out over the years.
Oh, God, it's kind of endless. So I've often mentioned to people that, I don't know, probably 3-4 months into kind of living in the monastery, I looked round the room and, I don't know, there were probably about another approaching 20 people living in the hall, and I probably had a bit of a grudge against every single one of them. Every single one. And of course, at that point, all being well, you start to realize, well, if it's everyone, maybe this is something to do with me. Maybe I'm the common factor here. I guess, in my own experience, perhaps a little bit mirroring Kaizen's experience, there was one person I remember who shall remain nameless, who, for whatever reason, I think just kind of took a little bit of a dislike to me. How on earth that could be, I have no idea, but there you go. So there was a kind of a needling going on and more senior than me. So I didn't have a lot of comeback here. But that was going on for, I don't know, maybe a year, couple of years, quite a while. And a certain, there was a kind of a sense of pushing. And, I was fairly good at rolling with it, but at a certain point something snapped. And, fortunately this person was a little bit switched on, because, that's probably the only time in my life I've gone after somebody with the intention of murdering them. And fortunately they kind of realized and managed to hide out. Lord knows where they were, actually. But I was seeing red, and you don't really want to do that, because, there's quite a few people in prison who it's just been one of those moments, where they've just lost it, and possibly even for very good reasons. And then something's happened that then there might even be a lifetime of regret. My folks, somebody I can mention, my folks have a very lovely lady who look after them, who sort of help in the house and do some laundry and cleaning and stuff. Her adopted son just had a bit of a thing outside a nightclub, some guy he had no knowledge of really, but it was all just joshing and mucking about. He ended up whacking this guy who banged his head on a pavement, died, and this young man is in prison for murder. Just an idle, drunken moment with a bit of nonsense and ego. So this stuff is very important and can lead to really, really negative consequences if we don't really work with it. And that's why I really appreciate that you've gone with the book title, The Art of Dealing with Difficult People. It really is an art that we can cultivate.
So I wonder if you could say a little bit about how you teach and how you invite people to work with their troublesome Buddhas within our Zen group.
Yeah. So I use the principle that my first Zen teacher shared with me. He said, first you learn to put it down, and then you learn to not pick it up again. So in other words, if we think about just a daily schedule, but often it runs, the time scales are longer than this. But if we think about just on a daily kind of basis, so, okay, you go out into the world in the day, you have various bruising encounters with difficult people of various kinds. By the time you come home, you're a bit of a rubbish bin of various kinds of angst and resentment and grudges and, all the stuff that you've picked up and your responses to the stuff you've picked up. So then, what are you going to do? If you, some people might have a martini and bang the telly on, whatever. We're going to propose perhaps a more skillful way. You're going to face that stuff. So you do your meditation practice, and if you're open and present and not actively suppressing, all of that stuff will tend to kind of, as it were, re-arise and perhaps even replay. And if you allow it to come and release, then you will sort of lighten that load. You'll unburden yourself. You'll become able to sort of empty out the rubbish, as it were. Now, on a practical level, in most cases, I find it works best, but for myself and just about everybody that I work with, I find it works best to actually, as much as possible, deal with this on the physical level, to find those locations within the body where that grudge or that anger or that grief is sitting, and to be with that physical embodiment of the stress or the distress. And being with that, it will release. If we're open, if we're not suppressing, and if we're not at the same time, doing a dance with it all, if we're not kind of rehearsing, well, what I should have really said is this, and then, and then I should have said that, and then I should have done that. None of that's terribly useful. If we're simply, as best we can, present with it all, then it can just swirl around, dance about, and it'll kind of come off like smoke, really. It'll just sort of, or like it'll kind of evaporate like steam. And we, can, as it were, unburden ourselves of the stuff of the day. And if we can do that every single day, that in itself is absolutely life-changing. And also, normally, within that process, we've also got some longer lasting stuff that comes up. Maybe some emotions, feelings from years gone by, possibly childhood, important previous relationships, teachers, parents, previous partners, Lord knows. Some of that ancient history will also come and release. Now, so there's a great sort of, you can think of it as a great detox or purification process going on. Now, through doing that, through having an ongoing kind of process of releasing like this, we lighten the load, and we also develop a kind of an enhanced clarity. What that gives us then is the opportunity to see this stuff coming in the moment when we're out in the hurly-burly. Our practice, as it were, comes off the cushion. We get out in the world, and we almost develop the sort of, you could almost say, the aikido of, as it were, not letting this stuff get stuck in the first place, of letting it just slide right by. Most of it is not personal, not intended to be personal. We pick up stuff that sometimes is just completely random. Some of it is definitely like a dart aimed straight at your guts. Doesn't matter. Either way, a lot of it we can learn to, as it were, sort of slide it, to just let it go by, to not buy into it. Now, that doesn't mean that we're turning ourselves into a doormat, but it does mean that we're clear that it's of no benefit to ourselves, and it's of no benefit to anybody else to be that rubbish bin in which this stuff gets dumped into. As we do this, obviously, we're bringing home less. We're carrying about less stuff. We're maintaining our clarity. And so when we have our stillness and silence time in the day, there's, as it were, a deeper level of clarification or purification can go on. And so we can set up a kind of a virtuous cycle here, where we develop the life skill of not picking this stuff up so much, and at the same time going through a deeper and deeper purification or cleaning, if you like. And so life gets brighter, more open, more joyful, more peaceful. And these people, these troublesome Buddhas, are people that we, as it were, are able to sort of navigate around. We develop the aikido of relationships, perhaps you could say. And you can have a lot of fun with it. It can become, as it were, a game rather than some deadly serious battle of the ego. And that's a miles more healthy place to be.
Oh, thank you so much, Daizan, for your wisdom and understanding, and some of your experiences and encounters with your own troublesome Buddhas. I'm sure many people will find that incredibly helpful and useful to hear.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and wishing you every greatest success possible with the book. And it's important stuff that you're sharing here.
Thank you so much. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review and a star rating on whatever platform you use. And do recommend it to others, because we all have difficult people in our lives, and each of them offers us a real opportunity for learning and growth. For more information about my book and what else I offer, head over to my website, markwestmaquette.co.uk. Thanks so much for listening. Bye for now.